This video is about nightmares and dream interpretation. When I was about 7, this would have been about 91, 92, on Friday and Saturday nights my parents would go out on dates. We had a live-in housekeeper who took on the babysitting duties. Her room was across the hall from mine. After I was supposed to go to sleep, she would stay up and watch movies. Inevitably, she would fall asleep herself with the TV still going. When she slept, I would sit on the floor outside her room watching the R-rated movies I knew I wasn't supposed to be seeing. The ones that really stuck with me were the Nightmare on Elm Street films, which I still love today. I've always enjoyed being scared, even though, I was scared. I've always been aware that scary stories are only as scary as you let your own mind believe them. In order to be scared by a good story, you have to let yourself take it in first. That is, being scared is an optional state you put yourself in. An enjoyment of that state is a tolerance, akin to the ability to eat spicy food. Just a note, specifically the movies that ended up haunting my dreams for years were the first and third Nightmare on Elm Street movies, so Nightmare on Elm Street 1 and Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. I think Wes Craven's original is a masterpiece. I love the third installment primarily because of the setting and the significantly more terrifying premise of something being terrifyingly wrong and nobody believing you, though I guess this exists in the first movie as well. Anyways, Freddy Krueger was my boogeyman. For me, no other slasher really comes close. Michael Myers is just a psychopath, no more dangerous than someone in real life who did something heinous you read about in the news. Jason Voorhees is a force of nature like an avalanche, killing everything he comes across. To me, the killing in itself isn't really scary. Pinhead and the Cenobites? I can and should do a whole other video about them. I only saw the Hellraiser films as an adult. I only count the first two as proper films, and since 3 they've all been trash, even if I love specific elements of them. Doug Bradley is fantastic in the part. He's older now and maybe he doesn't want to play it anymore, but he seems to love just chewing the scenery in that role. To me, he's as connected to the role of Pinhead as Robert Englund is connected to Freddy Krueger. Anyways, Hellraiser is about masochistic tendencies and their connection to pleasure. It's gory and interesting, but it isn't scary. That might just be a function of me being older when I saw them, though. But why do we have nightmares? To answer that, we have to ask why we dream. At least at first, this will make the cause of nightmares more confusing, but let's stick with it. To answer why we dream, I'll turn to our favorite turn-of-the-century Viennese neurologist, Dr. Sigmund Freud. Carl Jung's explanations are related and equally valid in my experience, but I'm much more well-versed in psychodynamic theory and psychoanalysis. Freud didn't set out to study dreams. As a neurologist, he was interested in treating hysteria, the kind that causes hysterical blindness and hysterical pregnancy, not the sexist colloquial way society uses the term to refer to overly emotional women. Psychoanalysis, or the talking cure, did actually prove to be greatly effective in treating the symptoms. It grew initially out of hypnosis. Freud would encourage his patients to free associate based on a prompt, such as, "Why don't you tell me about a dream you had?" As a result of this, he had the ability to interpret a great many dreams for his patients. He noticed certain patterns along with patterns in their hysterical symptoms. It had long been suspected that humans have an unconscious part of themselves, but no philosopher had, as of yet, come up with any formalized theory of the unconscious. It's always been clear that humans are often unaware of their motivations. Freud found in his concept of resistance, people unknowingly but actively tried to hide from themselves their own motivations and reasoning behind their behavior. The spirit of Freud's insight is preserved in the mid-20th century observation of split-brain patients. Corpus callosum, the bundle of brain tissue connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, is severed, usually because of extreme forms of epilepsy. Patients can be a lot more functional than one would normally expect. What often happens is a situation in which there isn't conscious coordination between the two sides of the body. A patient might button their shirt only to unknowingly use their other hand to unbutton it again. It's not that they lose complete control, it just seems that they're partially unaware of their motives and behavior. In these kinds of patients, unconscious impulses are easier to observe. I think it's certainly evidence for the unconscious. My full justification comes from empirical philosophy, but I also acknowledge the behaviorist and analytic philosophy criticisms of it. There's no way to verify claims of the unconscious scientifically. It might act as a good explanation for some behavior, but there isn't a way to isolate it for observation in any sort of objective sense. That's why I think it's more subjective, artistic, and open for interpretation. Anyways, when Freud would provide an interpretation for a dream, he would encounter resistance, usually as a reaction formation. For instance, instance, if he suggested that a patient's dream might mean that she had a sexual attraction to someone in her life, the patient would flat out deny it and might walk out of the session. They couldn't even entertain certain notions in their mind and would remove the source of their thoughts, in their mind the psychoanalyst, from their lives. Freud found that if he wasn't careful in revealing sexual or aggressive interpretations, he could lose his patients. There's nothing random or insignificant about behavior. There's always a reason for what we do, even if we aren't aware. This is Freud's starting premise, as it's one of the starting premises of empirical science. To reject the significance of something is to reject causality. When pressured for an explanation for certain behavior, people will often say, "Oh, it's a slip of the tongue," or "it's an overreaction," or "I misheard you." There's nothing random about these. They're called parapraxies, and they represent spontaneous fulfillment of unconscious impulses, usually immediately repressed or suppressed, and thereby often directly contradict whatever the intended behavior was. The classic example of this is the Prime Minister who opens a parliamentary session with a Freudian slip. "I hereby declare this meeting of Parliament closed." It's later revealed that he didn't want to be there that day, but suppressed that thought to fulfill his duties. Declaring Parliament closed is his unconscious fulfillment of that wish. It isn't an accident. Repression is indicated when the Prime Minister says, "Oops, sorry, I misspoke." The stronger the reaction against the interpretation of the behavior, the stronger the repression. To Freud, then, neurotic symptoms were nothing more than extreme parapraxes, reaction formations that are maintained so that a repressed thought or impulse never comes to light. For instance, one of his patients had a terminally ill father whose continued existence was putting a drain on the family's resources. The patient developed hysteria, which manifested as what's known as a conversion sickness. She became paralytic in her right arm without any known organic cause. In the course of her analysis, it was revealed that she was repressing a fantasy of killing her father. In the fantasy, the arm that held the knife was the paralytic arm that she developed in real life. Over a long period of time, Freud made this fantasy known to her. Once she was ready to accept it and own up to it, her paralysis disappeared. To understand this, though, we need to understand why we repress things. It has to do with conflict. Freud's patient saw herself as a loving, dutiful daughter. The urge to kill her father, at least in her context, with her father continually draining the family's resources and her energy as she spent time and effort taking care of him and ignoring her own needs, is understandable. Put in her situation, I could easily see myself growing angry and resentful, even if I still love my father. The conflict comes from the comparison of the fantasy to her self-concept. Loving, dutiful children don't kill their parents. They're not supposed to be the kind of people who would have fantasies of patricide in the first place. Rather than accept the fantasy and hold conflicting views of herself, though, her censor, or superego, demands that the fantasy never comes to light. It's her dirty little secret. This repression is reinforced by the symptom. The symptom is the censor saying, "Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I could never fantasize about killing my father. It's too unrealistic. After all, I'm paralyzed. I couldn't even if I wanted to." Freud's hypothesis was that dreams, even nightmares, are always wish fulfillment. Associative processes in the unconscious, which are condensation, displacement, symbolism, and associative word image configurations, serve to mask the wish fulfillment from the censor. So let's examine these processes. Condensation is the process of combining parts of different things into one thing. Think about how faces might appear in dreams. You might see a figure who you've never met before but wears his beard in a way your father used to a long time ago. The thought might not occur to you unless asked. Who do you know who styles their facial hair like that? The figure represents your father or some aspect of him. If the first reaction to that is no, absolutely not, it didn't really look like him, the beard was slightly different, the more certain the association is with your father. After all, he was the first who came to mind. Subsequent denial is a function of repression. Realizing the figure was your father was what your unconscious was trying to hide from you in the dream. If the dream is just a subjective interpretation based on what you said, then what does it matter if it's wrong? Or rather, by stating the figure isn't your father, you're in effect saying to yourself, "My dream isn't random, it means something. This figure stands for somebody, but it's definitely not my father." You might see why none of this could ever be objective or scientific. The interpreter is never correct or incorrect on his or her own. It's about getting to a point where the dreamer could entertain the sense of the interpretation. None of this is to say that all dreams are obscure. From the time of infancy, we have dreams that are direct wish fulfillments. We never said the sense of a dream is always repressed. Sometimes you get to drive that car you were admiring the day before. Sometimes you're having sex on a tropical beach during a vacation. These are called infantile dreams, and the only censorship that takes place is the idea that you didn't fulfill the wish in waking life. When something in a dream is unclear, use the same rule you would when dealing with children. If a child is clenching his hand and trying to hide it from you, he has something he isn't supposed to. Displacement is the process of attributing emotions in dreams to other characters. In this way, you have the emotion without having the emotion. We have a few different senses here. The first is that your perspective in the dream isn't necessarily you. You're not the one experiencing the emotion, someone else is. If that emotion is objectionable to you, it makes sense. It's been displaced onto another, because owning up to it would conflict with your self-conception. The other sense or insight here is that all characters and objects that appear in the dream are you. After all, it's your dreaming imagination that comes up with them. In a very literal way, elements in a dream are parts of your own mind, even if you experience them outside of yourself. They all play out in inner space. They're all technically made of elements of your own psyche. Symbolism in dreams is fairly obvious, but symbols are by no means universal. They're subjective, based on your own experience. The easiest symbolic principle to grasp, given dream censorship, is that something might stand for its opposite, or not. We have to know the context. Long, round things are usually penises. Hollow things are usually vaginas. The need for censorship here is obvious given social taboos about sex. Houses, rooms, and buildings almost always signify the body, and one's own body at that. Gods, kings, queens, goddesses, and other authority figures represent your parents. Going on a journey, getting on a train or a plane or another form of transportation, are usually representations of death. Nudity can represent clothes and uniforms. Another function of the censor is linguistic word association. Similar words are associated, and dreams present their corresponding images. Words can be associated by rhyme, synecdoche, metonymy, and countless other different linguistic configurations. Later on in his career, the PTSD dreams of World War I veterans gave pause to Freud's theory of a dream as wish fulfillment. What functions did repeating the same traumatic events over and over without change have for these trauma victims? Rather than alter his theory of dreams, it led Freud to revise his theory of the unconscious into first a more complete economic model, in which we have competing erotic and aggressive drives emanating from the unconscious, and then this led to the formation of the structural model, the id, ego, and superego. A trauma dream still reflects a wish, it's just the wish to die, a reflection of the death drive. Nightmares, though, aren't traumatic dreams. What else could they be? Well, what jouissance is expressed in the dream? Let's put aside masochism. Could it be that emotions of other characters in the dream are really our own? But who's enjoying themselves? The boogeyman, the pursuer, nightmares of killers and slashers and rapists, assuming a normal nightmare, not a trauma dream, are power fantasies. What's the most notable thing about a nightmare? The fear, abject terror. Where does that come from, though? Well, your own glee and enjoyment is displaced onto the boogeyman who's delighting in his or her terrifying, unrestrained actions. These are actually your own aggressive impulses that you've repressed and suppressed throughout the day. It's okay for Freddy Krueger to go on a killing spree. He's a supernatural serial killer. It's his job. You're an accountant. You're not allowed to do that. The fear you feel in the dream is related to the extent of the repression. When you express how real the dream felt, you're actually praising your unconscious direction ability, known as the dream work. It's done its job. You believe the manifest content, the content that actually presents itself in the dream. The latent content, the actual wish reflected by the dream, is properly concealed from you, and attempts to uncover it are met with both conscious and unconscious resistance. The fear you feel is the fear of having your desires uncovered. What does it say about you if you're the killer? Part of you knows this. Carl Jung had a word for this recurring dream figure, your shadow, a projection of all of the traits of yourself you consciously deny, coming back to haunt you. Of course, not all nightmares are of boogeymen. The key is always to ask, whose wish is being fulfilled here? The answer is always you, and the more you explore this side of yourself, the healthier you'll be. It can't help you to deny you're angry about something. That's not to say you should put on a knife glove and go kill teenagers, of course, but maybe dealing with your anger at your friend for their own self-destructive behavior, or admitting, yeah, I really felt like I wanted to hit somebody, isn't necessarily a bad thing, even if it conflicts with your unrealistic view of yourself. In some future videos, I may do some dream analyses of dreams I found on the internet or my own dreams, so look forward to that. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Check out my website, diamondbackmanhunter.com, where I've got my music. Take care.